Dear Dr. Soledad Artiz Prillaman and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to a very special webinar on political participation of women in South Asia. To briefly introduce NICE, Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is located. To talk on a very interesting topic of today, we have very distinguished scholar, Dr. Soledad Artiz Prillaman. Dr. Soledad Artiz Prillaman is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University. Her research lies at the intersections of comparative political economy, development, and gender, with a special focus on South Asia. Specifically, her research interests questions such as what are the political consequences of development and development policies, particularly for women's political behavior? How are minorities, especially women, democratically represented, and where do inequalities in political engagement persist, and how are voters' demand translated into policy and governance? In answering these questions, she utilizes mixed method, including field experiments, survey, and in-depth qualitative framework. Her field of expertise are gender equality, inclusive social development, inclusive societies, social inclusion, participation, policy design and delivery, reduction of inequalities, equity, poverty eradication, all of those which are commonly discussed here in Nepal. She has published many articles in different journals as a single or co-author. Some of them are taxes, inclusiveness, and economic growth, assessing the impact of pro-business taxes on US state economies, a strength in number, how women's group close India's political gender gap, does revolution work, evidence from Nepal's People's War, what constrains young Indian women's labor force participation, evidence from a survey of vocational training, and so forth. She received her Ph.D. in government from Harvard University in 2017 and a Bachelor in Political Science and Economics from Texas A&M University in 2011. Dr. Prillaman, once again, welcome to our program. Kindly make your remarks in around 30 minutes, which is followed by question and answers. This program is streaming live on Facebook and several other platforms. We would like to request all our participants to drop their questions in Zoom chat or on the Facebook Live, or you can also WhatsApp if you like. Or you may also tweet your questions to us. Dr. Prillaman, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I wanted to start by saying good morning, good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here. And I want to extend a particular thanks and gratitude to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to present my research and my work to all of you. So today, I'm going to share my screen now. Today, I'm going to present a little bit on women's political participation in South Asia, which is a domain that I have been working in for the last decade to try and understand why gender gaps in political participation persist, particularly in South Asia. But to set that up and to help you understand sort of why I think this is a really interesting and important topic, I wanted to present some data for all of you from the World Values Survey, the most recent wave of that. And what this graph shows is the gender gap in both voting turnout as well as in non-electoral participation. The blue bars show the gender gap in voting and the purple bars in non-electoral participation. And by non-electoral participation, I mean things like the many ways that we engage with the state in between elections, such as protesting, making claims on the government, contributing to parties and elections, and so all the things that we do outside of election days. And here, a positive bar, anything above 0, indicates that men are participating at a higher rate than women. And so a few things are striking from this graph. The first is that almost everywhere in the world, there is some gender gap in political participation that persists, with a very small exception in Europe and Latin America with respect to voting. However, these gender gaps are largest in the global South, and particularly in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. But what was most puzzling to me when I looked at this data was not just that there persist gender gaps, but that the gender gaps in non-electoral participation are substantially larger than the gender gaps in voter turnout. And so we can see in almost all regions that women are voting at much closer rates to men. There's less than 5 percentage points difference between men and women's likelihood of turning out to vote. But for example, in South Asia, the women are participating in between elections about 20 percentage points less than men, which amounts to about 3/4, 75% less than men. And so this tells us something about the nature of political participation and how we might need to have some nuanced understandings of what forms of political participation might be most constraining for women. Additionally, I think what you will probably observe is that the differences here are largest in South Asia, and the gender gaps are largest in South Asia. So I wanted to zoom in a little bit. The World Values Survey, unfortunately, does not survey all countries, but they surveyed 3 countries in South Asia: Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And the same graph is repeated for those countries. And what you see is that these gender gaps and the pattern from South Asia emerges even more strikingly across all of these 3 countries. And particularly in India, I think an interesting puzzle emerges. Women are voting almost at the same rate as men, and this is something that has been in the popular press recently, the rise in women's voter participation. And yet we continue to see these very large and sustaining gender gaps in non-electoral participation. And so what I'm going to hope to explain to you today is why it might be that women vote but don't participate in politics in between elections, and whether we should see women's voting as progress towards gender equality and women's political empowerment. But because I have spent a little bit of time studying Nepal and regretted that Nepal was not included in the World Values Survey, I wanted to present a little bit of data from Nepal as well. And so, as many of you may know, the local elections have seen underrepresentation of women in both the 2017 and 2022 elections in Nepal. And so what I'm presenting here are the shares of mayoral candidates and representatives that were women in both 2017 in the tan bars and in 2022 in the orange bars. And so the first thing to notice is that when we look at mayoral seats, we see that only about 5% of candidates are women and even fewer are representatives, meaning that these positions are almost exclusively filled by men. Now, given the structure of the quota system, that means that most women end up in deputy mayor positions. And so this is the same figure, but looking at the deputy mayor position, what we see is that about 80% of candidates are women in 2017, and 90% of representatives are women in 2017. And so this shows that there is substantial representation of women, but women are being relegated to the vice position under men. The second thing, though, that I want to direct your attention to is that while you noticed in the previous graph, I'm going to flip back now, there was not much change between 2017 and 2022. There was a marginal increase, but very, very small in women's likelihood of being mayors. But if we look at the differences between 2017 and 2022 with respect to the election of women to deputy mayor positions, we see a large and significant decrease, meaning that over 90% of deputy mayor positions were won by women in 2017, and now in 2022, only about 75%. And so there is a decline in women's representation in the second election. Last, I will just show that in ward positions that are not reserved for women or Dalit women, we also see the same patterns emerging where less than 5% of open ward positions, and by this I mean ward chairperson and open ward members, less than 5% of those seats are women. So we see similar patterns of gender inequality in electoral representation in Nepal. So going back to women's political participation, why is it that women might vote but not participate in between election days? There are a few arguments that have already been articulated in the literature, but most of these arguments are rooted in contexts outside of South Asia. So the first and most common argument focuses on access to resources, that The idea here being that inequalities in political participation are driven by inequalities in resources. And by resources, I mean things like education, income, time, political skills, the attributes and the resources that enable you to reduce the cost of participation and engage more regularly. Additionally, there's a large line of literature that thinks about the role of social norms that constrain women's role to the household and articulate and sort of set the rules that politics is the domain of men. And so these restrictive, more patriarchal social norms are assumed to inhibit women's political participation. And then finally, there is growing acknowledgement of the role that institutions can play in driving women's political participation. And the idea here is that lack of female representation in elite positions in electoral office can both inhibit women's aspirations and beliefs that politics is a space for them, as well as their ability to access political institutions. And so this set of arguments has been used to justify and argue for quotas in electoral office as having cascading effects for women's political participation more broadly. And while I'm going to argue that resources cannot alone explain this, I did want to show a little bit more evidence from Nepal that suggests that resources may matter, at least for the electoral representation of women in Nepal. And so along with my co-authors, we collected data on all of the candidates, representatives, but also people who sought candidacy in the 2017 elections in Nepal. And we compared the education levels of those political candidates and representatives to the education levels of the population. And so what you see here in the black bars is the education distribution for women and the education distribution for men. And then what you see in the blue bars is the education distribution for female candidates and representatives and the education distribution for male candidates and representatives. And what I hope you will take away from this is two things. The first is that political candidates and representatives are substantially more educated than the population as a whole. You see this by the fact that there are much more candidates who have attained at least class 11 education or bachelor's education than the population has. And the second thing that I hope you take away from this is that female and male candidates have almost virtually identical distributions of education. Now, what does this mean? This means that women candidates are as educated as male candidates. And this is despite the fact that if you look at the underlying population distributions, women still have lower levels of education in the population. And so this suggests that not only do things like education matter for getting elected, you must be, there is a premium placed on higher levels of education, but also that this holds true and in the same way for women politicians as it does for men, meaning that you must be even more selected, more elite with respect to education if you are a woman relative to women in the population. And I want to note that we did the same comparison for income and asset ownerships and found the same distribution. So these resources do seem to matter for being elected and brought into office. And so how does all of this shape the decision over whether or not to participate in politics? So the conventional assumption is that individuals are rational agents, and that women might participate less than men because the costs to participation are higher. This would be because they have fewer resources and because they might encounter social costs due to patriarchal norms. It could also be that women have perceived there to be lower benefits to their political participation because, for example, political institutions may be less responsive to their demands. But I think a key thing that I'm going to question in the talk today is whether we should presume that women have agency and autonomy over their political decisions. And instead, I'm going to argue that there's a substantial amount of coercion involved in women's political participation that suggests that women's political participation may not be an independent decision that they make on their own. Okay. Very quickly, just to talk through the argument, because I want to get to the data and reserve as much time for Q&A as possible. The main argument that I make in this work is that women's political exclusion, particularly as citizens, persists because it serves the interest of those with political power, and particularly men with political power. So what do I mean by that? I mean that at the most basic level, women's political lives center on the household, and households cooperate in their political decision making. This means that households are deciding collectively who they would vote for, as well as deciding who they would send to represent the household's interest in political spaces. Now, who is in charge of the household depends on bargaining power, access to resources, and social norms. And so because of this, men often have power over the household and have the ability to shape the political decision that the household makes. And so if women's political participation is useful for the household, then we would expect women to participate more often. This would be the case in something like voting, where turning out to vote more people from the household increases the likelihood that you achieve the electoral goal that you want. And potentially, if this is a situation where there is electoral exchange, such as vote buying or other clientelistic exchange, we would expect there to be additional benefits to having more people turn out to vote. If, however, women's political participation does not add value to the male power holder in the household or to the household in general, then we would expect the household to have a political division of labor, meaning that they would send one person to political spaces to represent the demands. And because women have less power in the household, they're less likely to be the ones who end up in those spaces. And so the implications of this model, which I'll show you more data for that will make this concrete, is that we would expect there to be no gender gap in voter turnout because men benefit from women's voting, but that women might have limited autonomy over their vote choice, that their vote choice may be decided by other people, suggesting that voter turnout may be a poor measure of women's political empowerment. Instead, we would expect to see a gender gap in costlier political participation where it does not benefit men in the household for women to participate. And so the only women who are likely to participate in these forms of political participation, which are mostly non-electoral, are going to be women who have autonomy from the household and those who have the greatest bargaining power within their households. There are greater implications, though, for this model of women's political behavior for broader structures of local governance that matter. The first is that because the household becomes the unit of politics, the fundamental unit at which politics is being organized, we would see households making shared demands on the state. And this means that there would be a privileging in political spaces of demand making and interests shared at the household level, as well as based on identities that are shared at the household level. But that's going to mean an underrepresentation of the interests that women have distinct from the men in their household and more gendered interests. And more broadly, we would expect to see local governance and political networks to be organized not around gender, but around shared household identities. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to go quickly through this next part to try to get to data as much as possible. But just to say, this understanding the model of women's political participation and what the roots of the women's exclusion are, help us to imagine what kinds of policies and changes and structural changes might lead to greater gender equality in political spaces, as well as women's empowerment. And so if this model is right, we would believe that women's participation is constrained by two things. It's constrained by inequalities in resources and bargaining power that elevate men within the household, but it's also constrained by men's capacity to coerce women's subordination in the household. And so it might be that women will participate when they have equal power, such as when resources increase, but that's a really hard bar to meet. And marginal transfers of resources are unlikely to completely equalize power structures. An alternative path that I'm going to explore in more depth in this presentation is the importance of networks as a mechanism for women to gain autonomy from the household, but also to resist the coercion that they may experience from men in their lives. through women's collective action. And while the bulk of this presentation is going to be focused on India, I wanted to provide some evidence that there is, that networks may in fact be really important for explaining some of the gender gaps in women's electoral representation that I discussed already in Nepal. And so in a study that we're currently working on, we studied the committee members who select the candidates for each party to field in local elections. And so we did a survey of all of these party members who serve on these selection committees. And here are a few facts that we found. First, we learned that only 10% of these committee members are themselves women. So the people making the decisions over who will be candidates are almost exclusively men. And we found that 40%, so nearly half of these committee members, openly stated that they did not believe that women could be as good of leaders as men, suggesting that there may be even inherent biases in these selection committees around women's capacity to govern. But importantly, the women committee members were less likely to state that women could not be good leaders and more likely to believe in women's leadership. So this suggests that having women on these committees might reduce some of these biases around women's electoral capacities. And while we haven't yet studied this with respect to gender, we've studied this with respect to caste identity. And one of the things that we have found is that there is a link between the presence of underrepresented groups in these committees and the nomination of members of those groups for candidacy. And so specifically what we found is that the more Janjatis that there are in these selection committees, the more likely that a party is to nominate a Janjati candidate for office. So this suggests the importance of networks and general membership in key institutions in shaping women's and other marginalized communities' access to politics. But for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on a series of studies that I have done in India, just because that is where I have more data on citizens and women's political participation as citizens. And the data I'm going to show you come from two surveys done in 2016 and 2019. The first spanned almost 400 villages and surveyed just over 5,000 women and half of their husbands. And the second was a complete census of all adults in 6 villages so that I could map all of the ties between every single villager within these communities. But I'm going to pair this with qualitative interviews with 200 randomly sampled men and women to understand what happened, how these processes play out more qualitatively. And if there's time, though I'm not sure there will be, I'll talk a little bit about 2 interventions that increased women's political participation. Okay. So hopefully what I'm going to convince you of in the next few minutes is that the household is the organizing unit of politics in rural India, that men dominate household decision-making, that this reduces or shapes women's political participation, but that public policy, and particularly women's access to women's groups outside of their household, can increase their political participation substantially, and that can be augmented as well by gender consciousness raising programs. So very, very briefly, let me describe the context in which we're working. So the political participation in rural India entails voting, as I've already mentioned, but the non-electoral political participation that I'm going to be looking at is largely attendance at quarterly meetings of all community members that happen or are constitutionally mandated to happen in every village in India, where citizens can make demands on their local elected representatives. But additionally, I will measure things like filing petitions with local representatives, as well as working with political parties and protesting. The state that I'm going to focus this study in is the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is the state highlighted here in yellow. It is geographically one of the largest in India and fairly representative of the central belt of India. But what I'm plotting in this graph is data on the share of women who regularly attend these village assembly meetings that I just described. And what you'll notice is that nowhere in India do more than 35–40% of women attend these meetings regularly. Almost no women are attending in sort of the northern and central part of the country. And Madhya Pradesh is at the extreme of this. And so this is an area where women's political exclusion persists in an extreme way. And I'm going to present data specifically from two sources. The first is that census survey that I mentioned, and I'm going to focus on 2 villages. And what happened when we did this survey was we listed out all of the people living in the villages. And in these 2 villages, you'll see that one had 1,400 residents, adult residents, and the other about 500. We then attempted to survey all of them and were able to survey about 93% of them. And the key measure that we're going to look at is a set of name generators. So this is where we asked each individual to name up to 5 people in their household with whom they discuss politics or with whom they socialize and spend their free time. And then because we have data from the entire village, we're able to match that person with the person that they've named. And this will make sense in a second when I show you some of these network graphs. I will skip a discussion of the interview data, but I'm happy to discuss that more in Q&A. So let's share a little bit of data here. So this is taking that network data, and the first thing that I want you to focus on is just the height of these bars. And so on the left, you'll see the average number of people named as political and social ties by men and by women on the right. And so the first thing to note is that men on average say they socialize with 1.5 people and discuss politics with about 1.75 people. Whereas women say that they socialize with about 1.75 people and discuss politics with about 1 person. So this already shows that there's a gender gap in political discussion, even though that's not rooted in access to other people, that men are discussing politics more often than women. The second thing that I want you to focus on is the difference between the blue and the red parts of these. So the blue parts of these, the blue shares of these networks, are the share of people with whom they discuss politics that are from outside the household, whereas the red are the share of people from inside the household. And so what we see is that men are discussing politics almost exclusively outside of the household. Only 4% of the people that they discuss politics with are inside the household. Whereas women on average are discussing politics both outside the household, but also inside the household almost equally. About 40% of their political discussion is inside the household. And the last thing that I want to focus on is the difference between the lighter shades and the darker shades. So the lighter shades mean discussion with men and the darker shades mean discussion with women. And so if we look at men's political discussion, it is nearly exclusively with men from outside of their household. In fact, women make up less than 2% of the people that men say they discuss politics with. However, when we look at women's political networks, they almost exclusively discuss politics with women outside their household, but they are very regularly reporting that they discuss politics with both men and women inside their household. And so this suggests 2 things. One, that men and women have different gender compositions of their political network. But because these things are not reciprocal, it means that men are not registering the conversations that they have with women as political conversations. Women think they are talking about politics with men more often than men think they're talking about politics with women. And so how might this play out in a network? So this is the smaller village from which we collected data. Each dot here represents a person living in this village, and each line represents a reported connection of political discussion. So this person reported that they discussed politics with this person. All of these people on the periphery report that they discuss politics with no one, and it's quite striking how many they are. But for ease, I'm going to remove them so that we can look more closely at political discussion ties. And so we can start to look at how this network varies by gender. And so here you will see the men in this network, and here you will see the women. And you already start to see patterns of men being more central and in the center of the political network, and women being more scattered and on the periphery of the network. And if we combine them, we see that play out more clearly. So the density of ties, the majority of these ties are concentrated within men here, and women are scattered more throughout this network, often tied occasionally to one or just a couple of other men, with a few clusters of women existing on the periphery. And so this highlights how political discussion is inherently gendered, but in a way that does not define village politics, that men are just very central to village politics. And we can compare this to the way that caste shapes the village's political network here. And so here I'm plotting different caste groups, general categories of caste. And this village has two main categories: scheduled tribes and OBC, or other backward caste groups. And what you'll see is that almost everyone who discusses politics does so with people from their own caste group, and that politics is completely divided by caste. So all of these people are connected to each other, and these people exist almost separately. And so while gender does not define the structure of a political network, caste does. I'm going to, for sake of time, skip these slides, but I think the point will be made with these data. The idea here is that I've argued that households will have a political division of labor in costlier political activities. And so when asked in interviews why women did not participate, the most common answer that they gave was that someone else from the household was already going. The second most common was that they did not have time. But the fact that someone else is representing them from the family shows that there is this division of labor and that the household is cooperating in how they decide on politics. But key to this is that households are also cooperating when it comes to voting. So 75% of women and 67% of men stated that their household always votes for the same candidate. And by always votes, I mean when probed on saying that your best friend is running for office, would you vote for your best friend or who your family prefers? And it's this share of women and men who say they would not vote for their best friend, but they would vote for who their family wants. And so here's an interview with Anita, who says, we decide to vote for one person altogether. If we decide to vote for Congress, then all of us will vote for Congress. It has never happened that we will have disagreement and not vote for the same person. And this carries on, the conversation with Anita carries on, and the interviewer asks, who decides who you will vote for? And Anita says, my father-in-law. And here you see the probe about, imagine your best friend is running for office and you wanted to vote for her, but your husband wanted to vote for someone else. What would you do? And Anita says, I will listen to my husband. I will accept whatever my husband will say. My friend is only a friend, but my husband is my family. And so this really shows the degree to which not just households coordinate in their vote choice, but also women defer to male leaders of the household in deciding who to vote for. And this pattern plays out in data. So we asked in that census survey, who decides who you will vote for? And here in purple, we see the share of men who say that they decide who they vote for and the share of women. And the first thing to note is that less than half of women say they get to decide who they vote for, whereas about 60% of men. Now, you might be surprised, though. Only 60% of men are deciding who they vote for. But this makes sense when we look at differences by age groups. And so if we look at those over the age of 40, we see that about 90% of men say they decide who they vote for, but still only about 50% of women. And when we look at those under the age of 40, we see that young men equally report limited choice over their vote as women. And so this really represents the role of a patriarch and the male elder of the household in deciding the politics of the household unit. And so this is not something that just impacts women, but also impacts younger men. I will skip this for sake of time because I know we are out of time. The main conclusion is we did an analysis that compared whether autonomy from the household matters for women's political behavior. And the answer is that it does. The more a woman's network comes from outside of her household, the more likely she is to vote, to participate in politics outside of elections. And that autonomy is one of the strongest predictors of women's political participation. And while I know I am just about out of time, I want to just highlight a couple of quick findings. I won't talk through all of the evidence, but one of the things that I studied after this was the role of women's groups as pulling women out of the household and giving them a space to discuss politics with women outside of their household and potentially collectively act. And what I find, let's see if we can what I find is that access to women's groups expanded women's networks outside of the household, provided an institution to foster trust, solidarity, and a shared identity, facilitated their collective action, and ultimately doubled their political participation. But then a second intervention went in and provided a gender consciousness raising program to these women's groups, and that further increased their participation. And so to just conclude, I'm going to skip ahead to the conclusion. What I hope to have conveyed is that women's political exclusion is the result of a system of politics that elevates the household and maximizes men's welfare, but that does not mean that there are not pathways to inclusion. And so pathways to inclusion that I focused mostly on are mechanisms to provide women autonomy from the household, which is possible through the presence of women's groups. And I think that all of this has implications, not just for the gender gap in political participation, but also for our understanding of how village governance works. As I showed you the network map of how caste shapes political networks, political ties, and political influence, that's in part a function of the fact that women are subordinating their political behavior to the household. It also suggests that some of the democratic institutions are upheld by women's exclusion. And so we might need to think about what democracy and democratic institutions being inclusive really means and how that might challenge power hierarchies. But also that when we think about women's political participation, we need to think beyond just outcomes and also to thinking about agency. One of the things I've shown here is that voting itself may not represent empowerment if not matched with agency over vote choice. And so thank you so much for your time. I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Soledad Artiz Prillaman. Thank you so much for a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. You have touched upon a wide range of issues, and you have also received lots of questions from the audience. So maybe without delay, let me share some of them. Like the first question we have received on WhatsApp is like, from your publication, it seems that you have been following the Nepal's People's War. How do you think the decade-long People's War or Maoist revolution has impacted the women participation in Nepal in politics?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and it's something we're studying now. So I'm only going to speak with a little bit of speculation from what we're learning at present, but hopefully we'll have even more concrete answers in the future. I think that there are two answers to this. The first is that I think that out of the People's War came a focus on increasing representation and making sure that politics didn't remain just an elite space. And so this manifested in the creation of these quotas. And so I think that like many other countries in the world, focusing on how political institutions can be designed in such a way as to elevate and represent women and other marginalized communities has come through quotas. And so I think that the design of that institution through the constitution writing process was an important outcome. At the same point in time, one of the things that we're looking at is how representation varies across parties. And while there is some evidence that there is marginally more representation amongst Maoists, it's not as striking as you would think. And so I think that suggests that our findings so far are that quotas seem to be the key mechanism through which women are gaining access to politics in Nepal, and that the incentives to compete for non-quota seats remain to elevate and field men. And so I think if we really want to see women getting into higher level office, regardless of the party, the incentives for the whole structure have to change, that it's very hard for a single party or a single actor to deviate if the incentives are misaligned, because they're not likely to succeed.
Thank you. Let me move to the next question. Like, we have received lots of questions within these kind of issues, like with reservation, women's participation has increased in terms, but they're in the second position, and as you have discussed, and and have limited role in decision-making process. So how do you look at these kind of representation, which is just in number but not in practice? And then another question, lots of questions within this coming from different countries. Like we have a participant from India saying that women have been given 50% representation in panchayats in Haryana, but do they have a real power, or are they just a rubber stamp for men? And there are many other questions within these kind of questions. So how do you react to it?
Yeah, I think these are really important questions. And I think they're things that we're just starting to gain traction on academically. So a couple of things I'll say to this. There was this huge boost of quotas in the last 30 years to the point where 120 countries in the world have some form of quota. This is the largest policy for women's empowerment across the globe in any domain. So I think the first is to acknowledge not just that this is one way that we have globally made traction on women's representation, but something that has expanded in recent decades. And along with that, there was this huge expansion of academic knowledge around the impact of these quotas for outcomes for women. And the literature at this point largely says they're very positive. They increase women's political participation, they increase women's access to services that they want, they increase women's ability to make demands on the state, they increase their ability to run for higher office. So it suggests that there are some very positive impacts of having these institutions in place. That said, like all of you, I also have questions about this and questions about whether this means true empowerment of women. And I think some evidence that speaks to that is in Nepal. You know, we see not just that women are relegated to these minority positions, these deputy positions, but that there are declines in that. In India, we see that less than 5% of unreserved seats are being won by women today. And we also see that all of the data I have shown you is from the last 5 years, 6 years. And so this is data where these quotas have been in place for nearly 3 decades. And so we continue to see the exclusion of women as citizens despite the long tenure of these institutions. So what does that mean? I think my takeaways from this, and it's something that I'm working on studying right now, and I think that we need a lot more study on, are exactly the things I described here around voting, that just because we see the numbers increasing and the gender gaps in these outcomes reducing does not mean that women have agency. And so when we think about measuring these outcomes and defining whether we've made progress, we need to be capturing agency itself. And so some of that came up in these questions, hinting at women's limited decision-making authority, whether women are just pawns and rubber stamps for men. Those are things we need to measure. Those are things that are very hard to measure. And so I think the first priority is figuring out how do we actually capture data on agency and authority in these positions. And I think once we can have that, we'll have a better understanding of the scale of these challenges. I think the second thing to say to this is that it's not particularly surprising that given enough time, those who have power find ways to hold on to that power when it's challenged. And this is the fundamental challenge with women's empowerment. What we're seeking is a system change, something that will create equality or closer to equality amongst men and women. But the incentives for that are not there. And so I think that in some ways we imagined a little bit too much from quotas, that just putting in place an institution to have such large cascading effects as to create complete equality was unlikely from the beginning, only because it does not change the incentives. It just changes the rules. And so what all of us are seeing and discussing is the ways that political institutions can be co-opted to serve the power of those in power, which we're now seeing with respect to gender, but has always been the case. Everyone is sort of motivated by those incentives. And so where does that leave us? So I see this as an exciting frontier. I think it's a space where we need a lot more evidence building. I think we need a lot deeper of an understanding of what do the limits to women's agency in electoral office look like, particularly under quotas. We need a better understanding of what are the incentives that keep the fielding of men and the power of men elevated over women. I don't think it's exclusively because of a desire to subordinate women. For example, it would be very hard to field a woman for a mayoral position against many other men and to see her win for many reasons. And so we need to think about all of those incentives, and then we need to imagine institutions and other interventions that can be combined. I think my beliefs, and hopefully soon supported by evidence, are that we shouldn't envision women's political equality as being something that can be solved with a single intervention. In fact, it's going to entail tackling the problem from many domains. And so we've made progress in one domain, and now it's time to think about what are the other spaces where we can add on greater support to ensure that that women's representation is meaningful and agentic, and that women have not just equality in numbers, but equality in power.
Thank you so much. You were talking about reservation, but people who advocate for meritocracy, who are often against reservation, often state about lower level of literacy of women political leaders, which you have presented during your presentation. How do you look at these kind of debates? And there are also debates, there are many examples as well, like in Nepal, on the issues of citizenship issue, like citizenship bill. It was assumed that female president would support the citizenship bill, which was in favor of women, but it is not the case. So does representation matter, or what matter is the agenda that is pro-woman rather than participation of women candidate?
Yeah, these are both really good and important questions, and where I actually do have evidence that I'm working on that I can speak to, some of which I haven't presented today. So on the first, this idea that quotas, there is an argument made that quotas are likely to reduce the quality of politicians, that we're going to see a reduction in meritocracy because of the imposition of quotas or reservations in the system. And in India and a few states, such as Haryana that got mentioned before, there have been impositions of educational minimums to try and counteract these effects. And so I've done a couple of studies, one in Haryana in India, one in Orissa in India, and then some of this work in Nepal on education and quotas. And a few things I can say. One is that, as I showed today, in all three of these states, the women who run for office are more positively selected on education than the men who run for office. Let me unpack that a little bit. What that means is that if the education distribution of women is very low, if there's a lot of illiteracy, the women who are being selected are being pulled from those with the highest levels of education. And so the challenge here, I think what this suggests is that the women who are getting to office have higher hurdles. They still have to have the same level of education as men, but there are fewer women who meet those criteria. And so as we see and address underlying inequities in access to education, I don't think there will be any of these concerns. I showed this even here, that for the municipal positions, the women who are elected to the deputy mayor position have the same levels of education as the men who are elected to the mayor position. And so while I won't say that it is a perfect equality in all cases, because in some places, education differences between men and women just remain so stark that it's very hard to find women with very high levels of education. By and large, the belief that the women who are getting elected to office are lower levels of education and lower quality does not seem to be met in the data itself. And instead, things like imposing educational minimums may disenfranchise a huge share of the female population when, for example, 80% of the population are under class 10 or something like that. And so all of that to say, more work is needed, but I think that concern seems to not be met. And now, one of the things I'll just flag that's really interesting is that because of historic inequities in access to education, the women who have high levels of education are young, under the age of 40, many under the age of 30. And so in fact, what we see is that the age distribution is very different. A lot of the women who are winning office are younger than the men who are winning office because they are the ones who have higher levels of education. And so I think there are implications for the distribution of education for women's representation. On the second point, the point about should we expect women to represent women, and what are the benefits of descriptive representation? And for this, I will say two things. The first is there is evidence that on average, by and large, women are more likely to represent the demands that women particularly make. But I think that we need to unpack why that is. So one possibility is that's because I, as a woman, know what other women want and I provide it, or I, as a woman, have a set of things that I want, and so I'm going to advocate for those when I'm in office. But I think there's another possibility, which is I, as an elected representative, my goal is to get reelected. And if I think, as I've shown you today, that the people who are deciding who is going to be elected are the men in the village or the men in the community, then I might be more likely I may not implement policies that I want or that women want, because that's not what's going to get me reelected in the next election. And so I think that there might be reasons that we see women elected leaders not doing as much representation of women's demands as we would expect. And I think that comes back to the point of this presentation, that if citizens are not participating, if there are gender gaps at the citizen level, we're likely to see limitations in the representation of women's interests, even when women have electoral office.
Thank you. We hardly have 10 minutes and we have lots of questions. Let me try to club them together. Like, if you compare the countries of South Asia, which country do you think is more progressive when it comes to political participation of women, and what is the reason behind it? That is one. And let me club another, like, what is the status of political participation of women in India? Is there an increase in political participation of women in India under BJP government, or it has declined?
Yeah, these are both hard questions to answer because they rely on data that doesn't fully exist. So I will do my best to answer, but I think one thing to say to all of this is that we do not have a lot of data on women's political participation. It's very hard to survey women in many of these contexts. And so the data that I showed in the very first slides is some of the best data that we have, and it is limited. It does not ask about a lot of the things you would care about. As you saw, it does not include many of the countries in South Asia. And so the first thing I would say is we need to really think about measuring these outcomes at a citizen level. And only then will we be able to answer these questions. On the latter question, we don't have time series data on this. We don't have data to track any of this. So what I can say is I don't know much about women's political participation in many countries of South Asia because it is hard to collect comparable data. What I can say is that from the data we have, women's political participation is marginally better, higher in Bangladesh than it is in India or Pakistan, but that there are still quite large gender gaps. And I think I don't want to speculate too much about what might be driving that, because I think that that's a really hard thing to explore. But one correlate, absent a deeper analysis, but one correlate I can say is that we know that in addition to networks, which I've described here, one thing that does tend to lead to greater participation of women is women's participation in the labor force. And so one possible explanation, not just for across country, but even variation within country, is the degree to which women have access to the labor force and the ability to earn their own income. On the latter question around what does women's political participation in India look like and how is that changing over time? We know some of this with respect to voting. That is where we have the best data. And what we see is that there have been recent and large increases in women's voter turnout, to the point where in India today, women are turning out to vote at generally the same rate as men. Whether this is attributable to the BJP is not something I can speak to, but it has coincided with the last few elections. And so what we do know is that the last two elections, and in particular the last election, was one where we saw the greatest rise of women, and there was a ton of news coverage of women turning out to vote at much higher rates. And so I think one open question is why that is, what has changed, and is that agentic voting? Are those women who are voting in their own interest, or is this some of the same patterns I've shown today? These are all open questions. Outside of voting, we have far less data. I do think that with greater focus on women's empowerment, not just in politics, but more generally, we're likely to see a growing trend towards greater participation of women. Whether that is going to lead to large scale change is unclear. As I've said, reservations in India have been in place for several decades, and we still see these large gender gaps. But I do think there's a positive trajectory in those domains, and hopefully we can get more data to speak to that better.
Thank you so much. We have like 6 minutes. Let me try to put last 2-3 questions so that will be end of you can make your concluding remarks with that. Like Dalit women have several layers of discrimination, like gender, patriarchy, economy, and then caste. So how can Dalit women can have greater representation by breaking these layers? And that similar question, like what are the major barriers to women participation of women in politics in South Asia? And secondly, like how to look at the role of media and civil societies in increasing the role of women in politics in South Asia?
Yeah, these are big questions. So on the first question, which is about Dalit women in particular, but more generally about intersectional privilege and intersectional disempowerment. And I think that there are a couple of things to say. The first is that these are real challenges. And so if we think that the models that resources lead to political participation, and the fact that Dalit women have less access to income, less access to education and other resources, then that's likely to impact their ability to gain access to politics. And so that's also going to inhibit greater participation. And I think that is completely possible. What I will say, though, that was really surprising to me is that in the places where I have collected data, the level of women's political participation does not vary by caste group. Dalit women are equally likely to participate in politics as women from scheduled tribes or Adivasi women, equally likely to participate in politics as women from scheduled castes, other backwards castes. There are not very many upper caste women, but even they also show the same levels of women's political participation. And the gender gaps within those communities are the same. And so I think what this suggests is, and I should note, they're the same and low. You know, these are still all domains. Women essentially do not participate in politics. Women from all castes do not participate in politics. And so while I think that suggests that what is disempowering women politically, something about gender right now. There's something about patriarchy that stands across caste. Now, where I think thinking about intersectionality is going to be very critical, and thinking about which levers are likely to change things. So it might be that that women's groups are better able at increasing women's participation if they have already access to education resources. I don't actually find that, but there might be some interventions that work better for upper caste women than would work for Dalit women, and that we have to sort of tackle women's political exclusion more holistically for lower caste women. But again, even in my work studying self-help groups and women's groups, what I see is that these groups impact Dalit women as much as they impact Adivasi women. What matters with respect to caste is the degree to which these groups have heterogeneity. So the more homogenous a group is, the bigger the impact is, which suggests that building solidarity within caste communities among women is potentially easier than building solidarity across caste communities. So it's a long-winded answer to say that it's a really important question and a really important thing to consider, but one for which actually the evidence suggests that on average, there are not as big of differences as we might expect. And I think that this starts to speak to the second question. The second question was very general. So, you know, if you zoom out of everything I've shown you today, what do we take away as the main drivers of women's lower levels of political participation? And so what I would speak to this is I would say that it is about the way that patriarchy structures access to power. So it would be things like, here I focused on the household. It is the way that households are making political decisions. It's the way that women are relegated to apolitical roles in the household. And so if we think about what might drive political inclusion, we should think about things that help to break that system down. So women's groups are one example that I found are effective. I've also highlighted that labor force participation is something that both takes women out of the household and provides them with power. We can imagine other institutional solutions, but I think the key here is all of those interventions have to address the fact that when women go home, they feel a lot of pressure, sometimes coercive pressure, to maintain their ties and sort of align with the interests of the household. And I don't remember the last question. I'm sorry for that.
The last question was like, what role of media and civil society in increasing the role of women in politics?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't have a good answer for that because I don't know the answer to that. What I can say is that there's a lot of norm enforcement through media and norm challenging. And so one thing to think about is how does the expansion of media increase or change the vision that women have for what's possible. I haven't seen a lot of evidence on this yet, but I think that would be a really interesting domain to study. Civil society, I think, plays a really important role. In part, this is what I'm highlighting with women's groups, that those are mobilized by civil society organizations, that women's movements can play a really big role. We've seen this across the globe, that there was a question earlier about when are we likely to see women demanding what women want? And the sort of most common answer across the globe is that when there are women's movements suggesting that should be sort of mobilizing around those demands. And so I do think that civil society and other ways to bring women together to make this a shared issue, as opposed to keeping women isolated from each other, are some of the main mechanisms to change.
Thank you, Dr. Soledad Artiz Prillaman. Thank you so much for your presentation. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in real, maybe in Kathmandu in future. We'd also like to thank all our audience for the wonderful questions. Thank you and have a nice day, and good night to our participants from Asia.
Yes, thank you all for having me, and thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, for having me. I really appreciate it, and then I'm invigorated by all of the questions that you have asked. I hope you have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod. Thank you.